Hey y'all, hope you're doing well today. So today my video is going to be bringing a book that I'm very interested in into the discussion, and I'm actually debating on covering this book kind of like I did with Women Who Run with the Wolves. And so if you have interest in that, let me know. Just drop a comment if you will on this video and let me know. I would love to get your feedback on that. So I'm torn between going through combing through literally every chapter and reviewing that with you all versus just picking bits and pieces here and there as it relates to the message. So again, I'd love to have your feedback. But today it's funny because I was actually inspired by, I don't even know where I saw this, I read this, I heard it, but you guys have probably heard of the old myth about the phoenix and rising. It's like a mythological bird. And so, and it's a different myth that morphs and changes throughout different cultures through history, but it's interesting that there's not a whole lot that changes about it. So it kind of reminds me of things like the collective unconscious, and it's like, you know, what is the baseline behind all of these myths, behind these, it's almost like these unconscious archetypes that pop up throughout our dreams, and so there has to be meaning there, and it just prompted me to pick this book back up. And when I did, I thought I really want to share what I'm reading with you all. So that's the plan today. I hope that you enjoy the message today. But the theme of the message is going to be related to directing our energy intentionally versus unconsciously, because I've mentioned before that I feel like our life force is our energy that keeps us going, that motivates us. It's like a creative force that we all have, and I feel like just like I mentioned, I think in the last video, it's like it's always there and it's always at work through us, because we are related to vessels in the Bible, right? And so it's just that numinous part of us, the divine spark. And so I feel like it's always at work. It's just a matter of us becoming conscious of that and aligning our intentions as co-creators of our reality. That makes all the difference right there. And so I feel like that's the reason why people can get stuck in victimhood, a victimhood mentality, and other people may be able to see different actions that this person is living out that actually may be contributing to less than desirable circumstances, right? But the person can't see it. So it just all goes back to creating our reality, whether consciously or unconsciously. And that's not to, I think the term is victim shame or blame, because that's totally not disregarding. I want to be clear that there are true crimes and a lot of things that are outside of our control, and I'm aware of that. But I'm just talking about those things that are within our control, just becoming conscious of that, right? So that we can do our part to manifest a beautiful reality, right? So I think it's healthy once you go through the early stages of healing after exiting a toxic situation, psychological, narcissistic abuse, whatever you want to call it, and you've been awakened. I think that it's important to make this shift in your mind, in your perception about narcissistic individuals, that they serve really as signposts. And in other words, they point us to where our power truly is, okay? Where our power truly is. And so if we start viewing people like that, it's going to kick us into this mode of observation just automatically, right? With this belief, because a lot of times we act unconsciously, even though we may be a very conscious person. There's still going to be aspects, because we have this unconscious part of our psyche, there's still going to be aspects of our involvement with our life that are unconscious actions. And so that's where keeping guard over our thoughts and our beliefs is super critical, because our actions are going to spring from those beliefs, right? So that's something we have control over right there, is our beliefs, because we can just guard our thoughts, just like we're instructed in the Bible. And so, again, if we can consciously make that shift to view toxic people as signposts, right, then they're going to truly help us to come into our own power. Okay, we're going to talk about how and what this means. I mean, essentially, it's an opportunity for us, if we view getting entangled with these people and you know, these experiences that were very difficult, and I'm not denying that. If we view that as, or all these experiences as opportunities for huge personal growth, you know, the kind of stuff where people relate it to a glow up, then it's going to, in my opinion, not only serve us better just to digest what we went through, but it's more closely aligned with the truth. And again, we're going to see how by going through this material today. Before we dive into this book, I want us to be clear that what we're talking about with regards to this path of growth and maturity is not applicable to all of humanity. And here's what I mean. There are those who are seeking and earnestly wanting to grow, right? To learn and grow. And then there are those who don't. They just don't. And you're going to be able to identify these people, because they're the ones who say, well, I just am who I am. You know what I mean? Or they might say, you know, they're sorry, but there's never changed behavior. In other words, there's evidence that you can identify, whether through just their direct bluntness, their words, or through their actions. You'll be able to identify that they are not going to change. Okay, so this journey, which I've mentioned before, it's called the hero's journey, coined by Joseph Campbell. It's only for those that want to be on that path, right? Truth seekers, people that want to learn and grow. That's who it's for. And it just goes back to that Bible verse, seek and you shall find, knock and the door shall be opened for you. So you have to seek and you have to knock. See, that's the piece that, you know, a lot of people they'll never get there. So what we're going to find is that there are fundamental truths and patterns throughout history, okay? And this book is going to be bringing up commonalities and points throughout all kind of different myths that include things like magic and spells and mysteries and myth and religion. And it's cool because I feel like whenever we hear these stories, they touch a place inside of us. It's like they feel familiar, right? But we may not be able to really identify why, but they do, right? And all it takes is just us to just listen and to hear the stories. And it's almost like it just opens up the Pandora's box of your mind. I don't even know what this means. I've just learned this term, so we can explore that together too, maybe. But in other words, just a rabbit hole of exploration. It just makes you curious, you know what I mean, to want to explore and learn and grow. The more you learn, the more you want to learn. And so it's just these are very intriguing topics to me. So I want to go ahead and summarize the first part of the book. He gives a really good introduction to myth in general, and I'm not going to read that today. I may do that another day. But there's a section on he mentions that he apparently has studied both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And I've never heard anybody describe this before, but he says that Sigmund Freud, if you remember, he's largely famous for discussing how much our relationship to our mother impacts us. And so he breaks down the difference here that Freud, that was his focus, was how our infancy and early childhood really impacts who we are, versus Carl Jung is more about the second half of life. And so But he's got a whole section on that, and we're not going to go into that today. But I do find it interesting because he kind of alludes to the fact that, and we're going to see this in what we read today, but in that first section talking about Freud, he kind of gives, he hints at the fact that there are people who will always stay chained to what he calls an easier fate, right? An easier path. It's like they're just always going to live in arrested development, essentially, right? Because they don't want to learn and grow. So let's go ahead and take a look at, if you have the book, it's going to be on page 15, and we'll go from there. So, all right. So this section is called the monomyth, and then myth and dream is the section, myth and dream. So I'm going to read a little bit to you. It says, and you'll probably start to notice about halfway through specifically how it's describing a narcissistic individual, right? Narcissistic characteristics. So it says the figure of the tyrant monster, and remember, this is like the theme of the villain that's constant throughout all myths and stories, right? Throughout time. The figure of the tyrant monster is known to the mythologies, folk traditions, legends, and even nightmares of the world. And his characteristics are everywhere essentially the same. He is the hoarder of the general benefit. He is the monster avid for the greedy rights of my and mine. The havoc wrought by him is described in mythology and fairy tale as being universal throughout his domain. This may be no more than his household, his own tortured psyche, or the lives that he blights with the touch of his friendship and assistance, or it may amount to the extent of his civilization. The inflated ego of the tyrant is a curse to himself and his world, no matter how his affairs may seem to prosper. So remember this. Self-terrorized, fear-haunted, alert at every hand to meet and battle back the anticipated aggressions of his environment, which are primarily the reflections of the uncontrollable impulses to acquisition within himself, right? The uncontrollable impulses to acquisition. Again, it's just describing this thirst, this insatiable hunger that a greedy narcissistic person has. They can't quench it, right? Yes, and just describing as being self-terrorized, fear-haunted, alert at every hand to meet and battle back. So they're always, they see the world as contrary, like they have to meet every situation from an opposing stance, like they're at battle truly all the time, right? And we know that this is a reflection of their internal state. Okay, we don't have to take this personal. This is proof why. Okay, again, alert at every hand to meet and battle back the anticipated aggressions of his environment, which are primarily the reflections of the uncontrollable impulses to acquisition within himself. The giant of self-achieved independence is the world's messenger of disaster, even though in his mind he may entertain himself with humane intentions. Wherever he sets his hand, there is a cry, if not from the housetops, then more miserably within every heart, a cry for the redeeming hero, the carrier of the shining blade, whose blow, whose touch, whose existence will liberate the land. So these are people who play the victim. They put on the mask of vulnerability, right? It's like they want to be saved. And in our giving manner, through our empathy and our love, we're just willing constantly, right, to bear this load that's unjustly just, thrown onto us. And it may not be visible to others because a lot of times it's psychological. It's like a psychological load, right? And we could just branch off and go down that rabbit hole and make that a whole video. Maybe we'll do that sometime. But I'm sure a lot of what I just read to you resonates if you have ever been entangled with a toxic person, heavily unconscious or and or a person who is conscious and intentionally abusing and manipulating and lying, right? This is applicable to a lot of different toxic behaviors, okay? So again, my intention with my channel, if you're new, is to put the focus on ourselves, again, what is within our control and within our power. So we're going to see that turn here as we go into the next section. And remember too that just like in the book I covered, Women Who Run with the Wolves, a lot of times these characters that are described in myth, like the villain or the monster, or the tyrant monster, he called it, they're personifications of parts of our own psyche, right? Maybe like the part that's unconscious or our shadow self. Or so the lessons are just layered and I would say twofold, but it's really more than that. It's just layers and layers of lessons is what I found. We can get just great insight into other people, humanity in general, as well as ourselves, right? So let's go ahead and go into the next section. It says, the hero is the man of self-achieved submission. But submission to what? And this reminds me of Stephen Covey. I've mentioned his book before too, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where he talks about the circle of concern, which is really like what's within our control and what's not. He's saying that everybody has this center point, this focus at our core. For some people it's God, and for other people it may be money or fame or whatever it is. And it's like whatever's put into the center point of our concern, our circle of concern, becomes like our idol, our God, even if it's not consciously identified as such. So it's really interesting, right? So again, he says the hero is the man of self-achieved submission. But submission to what? That precisely is the riddle that today we have to ask ourselves, and that it is everywhere the primary virtue and historic deed of the hero to have solved. This next section is really interesting to me. I was going to summarize it, but I like the way he describes it, and it's really important, so I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. It says, as Professor Arnold J. Toynbee, Toynbee, indicates in his 6-volume study of the laws of the rise and disintegration of civilizations, schism in the soul, schism in the body social, will not be resolved by any scheme of return to the good old days. He has in parentheses, archaism. I think I pronounced that right. Archaism. Or by programs guaranteed to render an ideal projected future, futurism, or even by the most realistic, hard-headed work. And see, I feel like I'm guilty of this, just striving to try and fix things when they feel, and I think that keeps us trapped, see, and I think that narcissistic people know this, and they use this attempt at fixing everything like this against us, right? Okay. So it says, again, he's talking about just issues, in the macro and micro, right? In the external world and in the internal world, both. Just trying to correct everything. There can't be a return to the good old days. There can't be some kind of idealized future where your mind is just out here. And then he also extends it and says, like what I was just saying, or even by the most realistic, hard-headed work to weld together again the deteriorating elements. Only birth can conquer death. The birth, not of the old thing again, but of something new. Yes, something new. New. That's what matters. And that's the shift. That's a big part of the shift that's going to really help us and put us on that path, right? To beautiful things. Okay, so it says, within the soul, within the body social, there must be, if we are to experience long survival, a continuous recurrence of birth to nullify the unremitting recurrences of death. Yes. For it is by means of our own victories, if we are not regenerated, that the work of nemesis is wrought. I think it's wrought. Doom breaks from the shell of our very virtue. This is interesting here. Peace then is a snare. War is a snare. Change is a snare. Permanence a snare. When our day is come for the victory of death, death closes in. There is nothing we can do except be crucified and resurrected, dismembered totally, and then reborn. And we're going to talk about that symbolism here in a little bit, okay? But you see how one can get to the point where everything is a snare, and I think that it's going to point back to our mindset, okay? So I'm going to skip a little bit, and then it says the first step, detachment or withdrawal, consists in a radical transfer of emphasis from the external to the internal world, macro to microcosm, a retreat from the desperations of the wasteland to the peace of the everlasting realm that is within. Yes. I like how he specifically calls it the desperations of the wasteland. Absolutely. And that's what people with bad intentions are. They're very desperate people. And that's a very dangerous thing. So skipping a little bit more, let's see if I can sum this up. Yeah, he's just talking about the renewal of life, right? He says, in a word, the first work of the hero is to retreat from the world scene of secondary effects, right, to those causal zones of the psyche. Causal zones of the psyche. In other words, learning that there are pieces and parts within our own psyche that may have been acting unconsciously to manifest a reality that wasn't serving us well or others well. So it's understanding that we stop blaming what's out here and we start taking accountability, right? Again, which is what a narcissistic person will never do. They'll always put the blame outside of themselves. They'll never take responsibility, okay? And look, that's, again, not to say that, there really aren't people out there to blame. It's just identifying, like I said, the parts and pieces that we can recognize as within our control so that we can take back our power. That's all it is. So it says, in a word, the first work of the hero is to retreat from the world scene of secondary effects to those causal zones of the psyche where the difficulties really reside, and there to clarify the difficulties, eradicate them in his own case, and break through to the undistorted direct experience. Yes, so we're no longer layering our objective reality with our subjective perceptions, okay? We're actually able to observe what's truly there, okay? It says, breakthrough to the undistorted direct experience and assimilation of what C.G. Jung has called the archetypal images. This is a process known to Hindu and Buddhist philosophy as viveka, discrimination. And I'm wondering if we could substitute that with discernment here, because how important. We learn after going through these horrible experiences that discernment is key. We're still in the prologue of the book called The Monomyth, and there's a little bit more to the first section called Myth and Dream, and I'm just going to encourage you, if you have interest, to purchase the book yourself and read that. He goes into some dream symbolism and gives some specific examples that people have shared with him, and then it goes into a second part here, and I'm going to open the second part today. It's called Tragedy and Comedy. Okay, and I'm going to read the parts that really stood out to me. Okay, tragedy and comedy. So it says, modern romance, like Greek tragedy, celebrates the mystery of dismemberment. Remember, think in terms of symbolism here, right? Metaphor. Okay, which is life in time. The happy ending is justly scorned as a misrepresentation. For the world as we know it, as we have seen it, yields but one ending: death, disintegration, dismemberment, and the crucifixion of our heart with the passing of the forms that we have loved. And boy, does does that ring true, especially if you've been involved with somebody who lied to you and used you or abused you or took advantage of you, manipulated you, controlled you, whatever lens you want to apply here. It's when you go through this kind of stuff and it shakes you awake, it's you're forever changed. And to start with, it's easy to I feel like have this horrible view of humanity, right? Just a total loss of faith in humanity. And I feel like the way he described this here is spot on. But what's important for us, and what I just read, is to again look at this symbolically, metaphorically. So he mentions dismemberment, okay, and disintegration. So I feel like if you think about it, in the early stages of our life, okay, when we are innocent, naive, unconscious, largely unconscious, our associations with people, our connections, are largely automatic and unconscious, okay? And it's kind of like, you might view it like a mixed soup, okay? And just think of an inexperienced chef or cook, and they're just trying different recipes, right, to land on the perfect one. And until they're there, especially if they're just starting out cooking, they may have just thrown all these different ingredients into the soup, and it may be horrible. Okay, but let's take a person who's never had any soup at all, and maybe they've only ever eaten one thing their whole life, oranges, whatever. And so they don't even know any other food. Well, they may taste this mixed soup and think it's wonderful, because again, you can relate this to being unconscious, right? Like when we don't know any better, because we don't have a frame of reference. We have nothing to give our associations perspective or context. You see what I'm saying? So someone who's never had soup, or they've only ever had one thing their whole life to eat, they may be like, this is great. But someone who has a lot of experience with eating different meals and different foods is going to be like, man, this is the worst soup I've ever had. It's kind of like that, in our early stages of life. And on one hand, it's kind of beautiful. Children are just so accepting generally of other children, and they just can meet a stranger, another child, and they're instant BFFs, you know what I mean? And it's really sweet and beautiful. So there's that wonderful aspect of innocence, right? But once you get more into your life experience, it becomes a great danger, to continue to operate that way. And again, that's why discernment is so crucial. So when he's talking about dismemberment here, I want you to consider a verse in the Bible, Matthew chapter 5, verse 30. It's talking about how it's a metaphor, again, with relation to dismemberment, cutting off your right hand if it offends you. And it says, because it's better to do that than for the whole body to go to hell. And the point here, because again, each of us are described as making up the body of Christ, right? One body. And so the point here is that if somebody is bad for you, if there's a toxic person in your life, if you have been able to identify someone who is using you and constantly putting you in this state of dysregulation and stress and duress and all this stuff, then at that point you start to go into what he's talking about here, where you're like, I can't associate with this person anymore, and that's where you are dismembering, right, your association. You're refining that soup. You're throwing out the ingredients that don't belong, and you're replacing those with the ingredients that do belong. Your own kind, your people, right, who inspire you, who are on the same path as you, and who seek to learn and grow, right? So I find what I've come across so far in the book very interesting, how the external mirrors the internal a lot of times because of our unintentional and subjective perceptions. But you can also look at it not just from a lens of self-evaluation, but also being able to more clearly identify people who are in a different place than you, psychologically, and whose intentions don't line up with yours. And so again, I would just encourage you to view these people as signposts, okay? And so the next section is going to be talking about when we just feel hopeless and we're tired, and it's going to go into talking about that. I've already highlighted some to discuss and share with you all there, but we're going to save that for another video, okay? So in closing, I just think it's important that we can identify that there needs to be a power shift within our perceptions, okay? It's like that internal light, the life force, fire, we're able to rekindle that, right? It begins to glow again when we shift our focus to our own psyche, our personal growth, right? We pull that energy back in. And secondly, we see that, again, the cycle of death, just like discussed in the other book I reviewed, Life, Death, Life, in the portion of death, that part of the cycle is required via disintegration or dismemberment from associations made during our unconscious phase, okay? And that has to happen so that beautiful things can blossom in our life, okay? In our new conscious life, okay? So again, pulling that energy back, realizing that it's you, and that's what it's about, and focusing on your growth, finding your own kind, and taking your power back. So I hope you've been encouraged with the message today. I hope that it has inspired you further to research the different aspects that caught your interest. And again, I would love to hear if you have interest in me reviewing a lot of this book. Please drop down below in the comments, let me know. I just thank you for coming along today with me. I hope that you have a beautiful day, and I'll see you again very soon.